Still in chapter 14, we're now in our second lecture on do human rights require democracy? So 14b. Well, we've seen that the straightforward inference just from human rights to democracy is necessary. Just this abstract inference, kind of just a pure philosophical, logical inference, whatever term you want, without digging into all the logical niceties, but just moving from the very idea of human rights to saying, oh, well, if we have those, that necessitates a democracy. He says you can't do that. You won't find that because it's possible, logically possible. And it's even empirically possible. So once you start bringing in, that is to say that you could have a non-democratic society that respects HRs. That's empirically possible, of course. So even when you bring in the empirical issues, it doesn't actually make things easier. It rarely does. I mean, when you move from the abstract, I mean, that's why logic is, in a sense, easier than applied issues, because in logic, there's just a lot less to keep track of, and things can be a lot clearer. That's why, logic and all these things abstracts from all the complexities and makes things simpler. There's a great value in that, but nonetheless, we live in a big, messy, sloppy world of empirical realities. So you can't just do the simple move here. So it's empirically possible. So Griffin changes his discussion into an investigation of these two issues. It's empirically possible that you have a non-democratic society that respects HRs. So yes to that. But it's an abstract one. I'll talk about this in just a second. You think of it, empirically possible, a non-democratic society. Notice in this one, I left society uninterpreted, but basically a very simple notion of society. But that's not where we're at, right? We're at societies now. Think of the societies that we have existing in the world. They come in various complexities. But I'm thinking of something like a major nation state, like countries that are large populate, like they have pervasive governments. Governments do a lot and more than they ever have done, no matter where you go on the planet. Governments they're way more involved in people's lives than even the absolutist monarchs of the 16th century. It's totally different, right? I mean, a lot of times and Griffin points out in these little mini history lessons he gives us, that even the monarchs that were absolutists weren't really absolute. Their power didn't reach right out into the countryside and right down deep into the lives of the peasantry. No, it was often certain land barons were kind of ruled there, and the king would sort of keep a distance, because if the king tried to have too much power and reach too far, the king could end up creating sort of a unity of his enemies that would come and oppose him. So there was a lot of give and take there. There wasn't really these big centralized, giant governments. Think about Aristotle, where, he thinks that the legitimate extension of a government, like literally the amount of land that a given government should govern and what's going on in it, should be really not much further than you could see if you stand on a little hill. So governments shouldn't really have that more than that. So for Aristotle, a nation state like the size of Canada would just be bizarre, with millions and millions of people, or bump it up a level, a little bit smaller in land, but bump it up in population. Think about like the United States, it's an extremely large country with millions and millions. And then India and China, I mean, these are vast regions with millions, and China's case, 1 billion in population. This is much different than these smaller societies where you think, well, yeah, in principle they could be non-democratic and still respect human rights, but pervasive governments, enormous populations to deal with, enormous social programs, whatever the kind of, whether you think they're right wing or not, all these governments, they have various social programs, and they're highly technologically advanced and becoming increasingly technologically advanced. So that is now all of a sudden the empirical issues they're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you think about all the issues that are created by the introduction of new technologies. Those have political ramifications. So Griffin says, you know what? I don't really think so that you'll have a non-democratic society in these modern conditions, that you're perfectly that it's perfectly going to be the case that they're going to respect human rights. Now, remember, no government is perfect. So we're not talking about perfectly respecting. We're talking about more likely and things like that. So likelihood. Remember, we're not talking about what exists contrasted with perfection or an ideal world. We're talking about what exists and what could be the case in existence. So we're not talking contrasting, like democratic governments with perfect governments or the perfect democracy, which is probably completely unfeasible, right? And so let's now think about our first one, the non-democratic, simple-ish society. Sure, in the abstract. You think about it, the fairness and human rights. So remember in the previous video, I talked about don't be bewitched by language. Just because you have the same word being used in various sentences, do not infer that that word always means the same thing. In other words, it could be a species, right? Like because, it could be like different species in a genus, right? And we saw that we had different ways of using the word privacy, and sometimes it was informational privacy, and sometimes it was just being used in terms that more or less cover the same territory as liberty. Okay, so in the abstract, we have the fairness that's involved in human rights, like rights to equality, procedural justice, fair trial. But as we've seen Griffin point out numerous times, that human rights do not exhaust the total domain of morality. Morality is largely a large-scale game of fairness, and there's a democratic fairness, like a fair say. We talked about that early in the previous video. Like, everybody, what do we mean by a fair say in a democracy? Well, everybody gets a fair say in the sense that, it's everyone, maybe except there's an age limit, but other than that, there's no restrictions on anything else as to who gets to vote or not. No, everybody gets to vote over, let's say, an age of 18 or something. Okay, that's not built in here, right? Like that fairness is not built into the notion of the human rights in terms of a fair say in decision making. And the efficacy that has to be built into the fairness and all that stuff. So there's two things, two ideas of fairness, right? They're not necessarily completely unrelated, but they're not identical. And the fairness here for the human rights, that can be respected in a non-democratic society, so your human rights aren't violated, but you still don't have the democratic fairness. So in that sense, the more abstract notion, that one can run through. So you could have maybe we don't find it hard to believe that you could have smaller societies that aren't democratic, but they're small, and maybe the effect of the governing bodies in those might not be all terribly pervasive, or they might, but by and large they would respect the human rights of all the members of the community, but they wouldn't, the leaders of the community wouldn't be elected, right? It might be some hereditary thing or whatever, but all human rights are being respected, and everything is just fine. So that's okay. So that's Griffin's point. So you could perfectly have that. So there could be lots of communities that are not democratic, and they're very respectful of their members' human rights, and they could even listen to them and maybe even bring this in or in some way. But it might not. It might be more like you will voice an opinion, but it's not necessarily the case that your opinion will have any kind of efficacy or whatnot. But other than that, all your rights are going to be protected. So there's some way you can come up with one that will fit this notion of a non-democratic society protecting or respecting and protecting human rights. But again, when you bump it up, no. There's basically, in this large modern concrete situation, there's so much power to be concentrated, and it will be so much concentrated and unchecked power that Griffin thinks that the UDHR was probably right in saying there's got to be some kind of democratic check on that in order, right, where the people have a right to have a say and a causal efficacy, right? Their say is not just merely the abstract right of expression, a say in saying stuff. It's got to have some teeth. It's got to have some bite. And that's going to influence people who are in power, knowing that the public does have, at the end of it all, some kind of bite. The public can bite back. There's got to be this notion of a government in some way, as the old expression goes, governments that don't fear their people, the people are in trouble. And when a government does fear its people a little bit, like it fears the reaction, it fears public opinion, it fears the polls and whatnot, and that gives the public power to push back against the government. And that's going to more or less likely be a greater chance of respecting human rights. Again, no democratic government is perfect, so don't, just because we can point out all kinds of flaws in our governments, in our democratic governments, I mean, that's not really a challenge. It's pretty easy to go around and point out flaws in governments and systems that are liberal democratic. That's not really a challenge. You can do that. But the question is not so much of perfection in democracy, says Griffin. It's one of like legitimacy. Is this a legitimate government, right? Is this a democratic government that's legitimate, not perfect? And we're talking about the exercise in power is generally just. Mistakes are made. Sometimes, things are trampled a little bit here and there. Not extreme, right? But, we do, and democratic governments do have systems in place by which they can invoke a certain measure, a temporary measure, suspend some human rights, and then so they appropriate some extra power. And be kind of non-democratic about something, but then it's quickly rescinded. And all this is charted out in the rule of law. So the government can't arbitrarily appropriate this power. And if they do, let's say if they do it in a non-democratic fashion, like having to quickly appropriate some power, it's done in an emergency measure, and then the power must be rescinded after so long or re-invoked. And then there's got to be a court case investigating as to were the original reasons, valid and just to override human rights in a non-democratic way, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see there's all kinds of mechanisms that would have to be built in order for a democratic government that's not perfect to be nonetheless legitimate. And of course, also built into the notion of legitimacy is, if you think about it, if you wanted to just take a government that just had the minimum standard of HR, like looking for the lowest level of human rights that would have to be maintained in order to say that human rights are maintained, there wouldn't have to be a lot. Like, I mean, there could be sort of a minimalist type of government. That's not really legitimate, according to Griffin. That a legitimate democratic government really is aiming at broadening and becoming a more moral system. Sometimes what in the Americans like to say, becoming a more perfect union, is always striving to get better and increase the morality. Maybe finding out how to make the society. And here in Canada too, it's sort of written into the notion of, from the Supreme Court that one of the goals is to increase the level of democracy in a country by making it increasingly democratic and more of a moral, perfect society, etc. But it's always ongoing. You're never going to achieve that perfection. But the legitimacy demand is that you are always looking for it. You're not looking for the minimum standard that you can get away with. You're looking for higher standards. And if you were to err on the side of human rights, you would have too many rather than just a mere minimum, or even worse, not enough. Okay, so in sum, the question of the chapter was, do human rights require democracy? Well, not necessarily. You might be able to have empirically existing societies that are quote unquote, not with big governments. The populations aren't huge. The whole structure of the entire society is not like this giant bureaucracy with millions of people and social programs. It could be a much more straightforward kind of society. Sure, that's entirely possible. So it's not the case that every society that isn't perfectly modeled on a liberal democratic society would be morally problematic and is automatically not respecting human rights. No, that's not the case. But what seems to be the case, says Griffin, is that if you have these non-democratic societies that are large, modern not in any more sense of the term that they're pervasive, large populations, highly technologically advanced, that probably not really. You're looking at the only way that's going to have a good check on that much power, because power also naturally tends to collect and coalesce. You need some major form of checking it, and that, of course, would be a kind of democratic check. So, do they require democracy? Yes and no, depending on the empirical realities.